All right, everybody, good morning. This is Jomo Stewart here in the boiler room of the Fairbanks Economic Development Corporation. It is Tuesday, Tuesday the 16th of February, here at about 8:02 in the a.m. It's the Energy for All Alaska Task Force meeting. And so we'll go ahead and get started. Our very special guest this morning is President Frank Richards of the Alaska Gasline Development Corporation, as well as Miss Lisa Parker of his staff, here to give us an update regarding the Alaska Gasline, of which there have been some very recent and exciting announcements. So again, do feel free to post questions in the chat box or to go ahead and unmute and ask them. But with no further ado, Mr. Richards, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Jomo. And to the audience, I would say, as I go through the presentation, by all means, pose your questions. I just assume not have to have you listen and then wait till the end. I'd like to be able to address your questions and inquiries as they come up. But today, I really wanted to focus on this economic recovery initiative, is what we're calling it, on the Alaska LNG project. And many of you know that the concept around the Alaska LNG project has always been about commercializing the North Slope natural gas and then bringing it to markets both in Alaska as well as abroad. Today, I want to talk about what we're calling a phased approach, or phase one of that project, which is really about providing energy to Alaskans first, so gas to Alaskans. And that has to do with the concept around building the pipeline first from Point Thompson to Fairbanks. So before I get going, Jomo, if we can advance the slide. Okay. We all have realized the state of affairs in the pandemic that we're living in, and especially how Alaska has been impacted by it. I wanted to share this with you, which was a recent report by the Department of Labor and Workforce Development that kind of shows the severity that Alaskans and Alaskan job growth has been impacted over the last year. We're 49th in private sector job growth. We're 48th in job growth overall. Those are staggering numbers when we look at the impacts to our economy. And we all see that. We've seen the impacts to the tourism industry. We've seen it now to the oil and gas industry, and we're seeing it across the spectrum of Alaska's economy. So next slide, please, Jomo. So the staggering numbers are essentially that as of November in 2020, our employment was at 293,500 jobs. Alaska shed almost 27,000 jobs, dropping us to employment levels back to 2003. Our population has also been dropping since 2017, and we've lost more movers than we gained in the last 7 years in a row. In Anchorage, our 2020 job loss was the largest in our history, even bigger than the 1980s bust. The city's lost nearly 14,000 jobs in less than 12 months and damaged nearly every industry across our economy. These numbers here show by various sectors of the economy: 7,000 in leisure and hospitality, 3,100 in transportation, 2,900 in oil and gas sector, or almost 30%. Over the last 5 years, we've lost more population. We're losing about 60.5 people for every 1,000. That's from 2014 through 2020. Our oil and gas jobs hit a peak in 2014 at 15,000. And so you can see now, if we're down to 2,900, that we're at a significant reduction over that time frame, especially in our northern region, where we're seeing about a 17% change in jobs from 2019 December through 2020. So you all know and are experiencing the significant impacts of the pandemic in your own communities and in your industries. So next slide, please, Jomo. So what we have proposed is, again, around the Alaska LNG project, we have advanced through our work through the year 2020 to completion of an environmental impact statement led by the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. And in addition to that, FERC provided AGDC with an order, which is their authorization to construct the Alaska LNG project. We've received our federal rights of way across both Bureau of Land Management and National Park Service lands. We've received major federal permits from the Pipeline Hazardous Material Safety Administration, from the EPA's water certification, and all the federal authorizations that we need to construct this project are in our hand. So that's why we call this project shovel ready, because we have the federal authorizations necessary to construct. Now, through 2020, we've also been working what we call strategic parties, folks that we're looking to bring into the project or are in the project, and to advance the project with a private sector-led development. Governor Dunleavy, when he came in, was very clear that he wanted the project to be led by the private sector. We originally engaged initially with BP and ExxonMobil, and they provided us funding to be able to advance our work to complete those federal authorizations through 2020. And now we're bringing on additional federal, private sector partners to be able to advance the project in total. But today I wanted to talk about this initial phase. It's a $5.9 billion clean energy infrastructure initiative that would have significant benefits, not only in terms of creating jobs, but providing cleaner burning, lower cost energy for the interior of Alaska and ultimately for Alaskans along the pipeline route. It'll address the air pollution problems, and ultimately through the sale of gas offshore, be able to help with the issues around climate change. Now I know there's a lot of skepticism because of the Biden administration, and their initiatives, but I'll talk about that a little bit later. But this concept of a shovel-ready initial project for Alaska was one thing that we went to Governor Dunleavy with and identified if there are opportunities for funding to be able to accomplish a project, here's a project that would meet the goals of job creation, cleaner energy, and lower cost fuel for Alaskans. And that's what attracted him to supporting this project, to be able to identify a funding source, in this case, federal funding source, to be able to provide for what we call critical infrastructure in Alaska. Now, we've also been working, as I said, with private sector to be able to help advance the full-scale Alaska LNG project. But in this case, we now have what we call a world-class pipeline company that has the financial and technical capabilities to lead this project, including putting their own financial assets to bear. And that's where we're working with that private sector entity to be able to come on to develop this project, to operate this project, and advance this project through the initial phase. Now, from the governor's State of the State in his most recent op-ed, he calls this a generational dream. And it's calling it for Alaska's time to think big. And that's really about because of the situation that we find ourselves in with an economy that has been severely impacted. And so if we have an opportunity to be able to attract funds to do this, then now's the time to be able to accomplish it. It's been a long-standing goal for many Alaskans, for many Fairbanksians for decades. And so that's our goal, of being able to move this forward now that we have the permits in place to be able to start the work. So besides the economies in Fairbanks, this also has the benefit of providing potentially stable fuel sources for the military bases. But we'll talk about that a little bit. Now here's the concept of an initial phase. The Alaska LNG project was to take gas from both the Prudhoe Bay units and Point Thompson units, condition the gas, and then send it down the 807-mile pipeline to a liquefaction facility in Nikiski. This concept looks at using Point Thompson gas initially because it does not require the high capital expense of the gas treatment plant in Prudhoe Bay to remove the higher levels of CO2 found in that gas stream. What this would do would be pre-build, or the initial phase of building out that Point Thompson transmission line, which is a 32-inch above ground pipeline that would lead to a flange at the location of the future gas treatment plant in Prudhoe Bay, and then connect up to the 42-inch main line, a buried pipeline that would lead from Prudhoe Bay down to Fairbanks. Now, the importance of this is that it's an initial phase of the project. And under our authorizations, as long as we're building and phasing phases to the design concepts that we went through the environmental process with, then FERC has agreed with us that we can move this project forward. So there's a comment.
Yes, sir. The game's afoot. Franks, thanks for this presentation. The AGDC map shows different colors for 3 parts of the initial line. Explain Fairbanks's lateral ownership, cost, and known details, especially approval status.
Okay, Mr. Mayor, thank you for the comments, and I'll take you back to your days on the AGDC board when we were advancing then the Alaska standalone pipeline project. And in that project, if you remember, it was gas from Prudhoe Bay down to South Central Alaska with a lateral leading into Fairbanks. That project, we went through engineering, front-end engineering and design, delivered a cost estimate, and actually concluded an environmental impact statement. That environmental impact statement and those authorizations included the Fairbanks lateral. So that was a 12-inch lateral that came off of the pipeline down by the Chattanooga River, and then came up over Murphy Dome, and then came into Fairbanks proper. So that line, that lateral, was permitted under the Alaska standalone pipeline project. That cost estimate was approximately $170 million, which includes a 20+% contingency in it. The concept that we are working on now with this Alaska LNG project is the Alaska LNG project would develop the main line, and then there are private sector entities that would like to develop the lateral leading into Fairbanks. So to do that, we have the authorizations under the ASAP project. It would require a slight modification under the core authorization, but we feel that that would be achieved in a relatively short period of time.
Follow up, Mr. Mayor? Okay. Just know, of course, that there will be plenty of opportunity to ask further questions as we go, and I can always flip back and forth between slides if you need me to.
Yeah, thanks, Frank, for that detail. Thank you.
Okay. So again, the priorities of this initial phase is for gas to Alaskans. It's to be able to meet the needs of interior Alaska, hopefully providing a relatively stable long-term source of fuel as the initial phase of the project. And the concept is, again, to go to full build out, which is the export authorization that we have to deliver gas to the Asian markets. What this initial phase does is significantly de-risks the Alaska LNG project, because always in the risk registry, the pipeline portion was one of the main considerations of how we would actually get the project completed due to our extreme regulatory environments. So by building the initial phase, we think that significantly reduces the risk for the project and project sponsors. And it also eliminates or takes out approximately $6 billion worth of cost out of the project. All right, so the question from Gary Wilkin, how the project plans on mitigating the CO2 impacts. Well, again, the Point Thompson gas, what we're calling it, it will be utility grade gas. So similar to the N-Star spec that we have in South Central Alaska, which allows up to about 3% CO2 in the gas stream to be able to be burned at the burner tip. What we would work with the Point Thompson unit owners is to provide us a similar spec gas, and any of the gas, as you remember from Point Thompson, is brought up, the condensates are removed, and then gas is pushed back down into the reservoir. The same would be true of anything that is pulled off from the gas stream provided to us. It would be pushed back down into the Point Thompson reservoir. That's similar to what we envision overall with the gas treatment plant, where we'll be removing for the LNG, which is a much higher, detailed specification on CO2, where we have to get down to 50 parts per million. There, the CO2 would again be captured in the gas treatment plant and then pushed back down into the Prudhoe Bay Reservoir for pressurization.
Thank you, Frank.
You're welcome, Gary.
So essentially distribution grade gas as opposed to LNG grade gas.
That's correct. At
Okay.
this initial phase. All right, and then overall, the goal is again to move the Alaska LNG project into private sector sponsorship. So next slide, please, Jimmo.
Okay.
So the benefits that we see of this is that it provides some near-term economic recovery for Alaska and Alaska's industries. This project will be 4 years from final investment decision through to gas delivery. In the first 24 months, though, we're looking at approximately $1.5 billion impact to Alaska through benefits of jobs, materials, equipment, contractor, but then ancillary benefits coming from the multipliers for indirect jobs. When I talk about direct jobs, these are the jobs that would be on the right of way constructing the project. As I said previously, we've got the authorizations. We would, as soon as we got the funding in hand and we were able to get through that final investment decision, we'd be able to let contracts to be able to provide folks to go out into the field. We have to do right-of-way surveys. We have to open up material sites. We have to open up access roads. We have to start working on the right-of-way to get it ready for the pipeline. So those are those initial jobs. Okay, methane is a major greenhouse gas along with CO2, especially in natural gas and LNG fields and transport. Can you speak to methane leak, flaring, release mitigation? So around methane leak, we are going to be building to current industry standards and current PHMSA Pipeline Hazardous Materials Safety Administration standards to provide for leak prevention. The flaring that would potentially occur would either be at the Point Thompson unit itself, which would be the upstream operator's prerogative, responsibility, or with the full Alaska LNG project at Prudhoe Bay with the gas treatment plant, we would have upset flare capabilities. But the goal is to not have to flare this gas, but to capture the gas, to utilize the energy into it, and allow it to be consumed by the consumers in the power plants. Okay, so back to the slide. The benefits are, again, almost immediate benefits into the Alaska's economy as we get jobs and wages being paid to our private sector employers, and then ultimately provide for the private sector to take on the responsibility and ownership of this. Now, these indirect jobs at 20,000, that's a multiplier of about 15. This is not a number that we came up with, but actually came from what is now the McKinley McDowell Group research that talked about job benefits. And these are coming from the economic resource data that we developed concurrently for our EIS process. So the goal is get the project going, have an economic benefit to Alaska's economy, and then ultimately provide for lower cost energy. Those are the three themes that you'll keep hearing from me today. So next slide, please, Jimmo. Now again, when the Alaska Gasline Development Corporation was created, we also were given the responsibility soon thereafter under what's known as Senate Bill 138 to represent the state in the Alaska LNG project. In that legislation, though, it provided us with the intent of the legislature, and that's really the key, is that when this project is developed, to be able to make sure that we have Alaska residents and Alaskan contractors and Alaska businesses to be able to go to work on this project. As far as making sure that we have Alaskans that are actually benefiting from this, as opposed to folks from the lower 48 or international companies coming in and then capturing those jobs. Our goal is, again, to make sure that Alaskans get to work, and we feel that with the overall project, there'll be more than enough jobs for Alaskans to be able to put to work. And we'll be working with the Department of Labor and Workforce Development to make sure that we've got a good handle on where those skill sets are and where there are needs for more training programs to be able to make sure that there are folks capable and able to work on this project. So currently the Commissioner of Labor sits on our board. She is now working with us to be able to develop that plan and be able to move it forward to make sure that we have a workforce capable of exercising this project. Next slide, please, Jimo. And to this end, in 2018, my predecessor into the former administration worked on a hiring agreement with labor organizations and construction trade groups for the Alaska LNG project. It was really a memorandum of understanding with the Trades Council to really help provide the framework for advancing the work with the engineering, procurement, and construction firms around project labor agreements. So the precursor to what it would be to bring Alaskans to the table to be able to represent the needs of Alaska workforces with the EPCs, as opposed to the national labor organizations be able to interface themselves. So the goal was to be able to have Alaskans stating the needs and be able to negotiate for those labor contracts with the EPC contractors going forward. So that's in line with our Alaska hire and content provisions. Next slide, please, Jimo. So when we talk about infrastructure projects and we talk about Alaska LNG, it's not only about Alaska, but there's also going to be jobs that will be created in the lower 48. And so we use this map to show that it has impacts in Mississippi and Arkansas, in Illinois and Oregon and other locations to be able to transport all those goods and commodities to Alaska, so that when we're back and talking to Congress about the opportunity for infrastructure development in Alaska, we're not talking solely about dollars spent within the borders of Alaska, but there'll be dollars spent in the United States as well. And so that's where we can reach out to those congressional and senatorial offices to be able to identify where we're going to have positive impacts in their home states. Okay, so on to the ancillary benefits besides jobs. When we talk about environmental benefits, you all live it, we all hear about it, but again, you have some of the worst air quality in the nation, unfortunately. And so our goal is to be able to bring some relief with lower cost of energy to be able to help hopefully drive more of the population to natural gas burning rather than diesel and wood, and be able to help with some of those air quality issues. Now, the military base, as you probably are aware, Fort Wainwright is out under an environmental impact statement right now, looking at replacement of their central heat and power plant, one of the oldest coal-fired units in the Army's inventory, I'm told, to something different, whether it be dual fuel turbines. And so if that plant converts, then that would be, again, a ready, steady, it would need ready, steady supply of lower cost energy to be able to sustain it into the future. And that's what we feel with the Alaska LNG project and the massive reserves on the North Slope, we could be able to provide that to you. Senator Sullivan, in his work with the National Defense Authorization, has language that he's put into that bill over the last several years, helping to direct the military towards sustainable and reliable energy sources out into the future. And so we've been in conversation with the Senator's office as well as with the Department of Defense about the opportunity to be able to have a long-term stable priced natural gas source for the military bases in interior Alaska. And then ultimately, as we all know, for economic development, specifically in the mining sector, energy and transportation are always the two of the main hurdles that they have to address. If we can provide with down through the spine of the state, a pipeline that could provide long-term stable energy, hopefully that will then allow for additional developments to occur in our mining areas that have always been challenged due to the cost of energy. And then as we look towards the manufacturing of renewables and electric vehicle components with our critical elements, Alaska is blessed with some of those critical elements, but again, getting them to market requires lower cost energy and better transportation. So we're hopeful that we'll be able to provide some of those ancillary benefits with the construction of this project. Next slide, please, Jimo. Okay. So what does this mean in regards to the energy cost for Alaskans? Because that's really one of the primary goals that the governor had put out in front of us, was to put forward a project that would provide for long-term stable pricing. And so with the disproportionate amount of money that folks in the interior spend for your power, it's kind of an oxymoron that we've got some of the largest untapped proven gas reserves in the world very close by. We want to be able to bring those to be able to help you and reduce your overall costs. Initially, when we look at this project, we're talking about reducing costs by about 25%, and we used around a $20 per million BTU threshold as the baseline. And then that would mean that we'd be looking to deliver on the initial phase at about $15 per million BTU. And then once the Alaska LNG project itself is constructed in total, then we'd be looking at bringing those dollar costs down by about 75%, or around to the $5 per million BTU. Now, I was reading this morning on some of the impacts, most recently of the cold snaps down south, or even the impacts in California, but prices were upwards into the hundreds of dollars per million BTU over the last week or so. And that's really, as we know, it's a point in time, but it just shows the critical nature of those price fluctuations can occur when they're based on a hub price. Whereas what we're talking about here would be a long-term stable pricing that would be based on those gas sales contracts that we would get from the producers on the North Slope. So next slide, please, Jim. Now on to the bigger challenge with the new administration that has come out and identified that they have grave concerns about the use of hydrocarbons. However, they also see the benefits of providing for transition to those renewable goals and carbon net neutrality that they've set. And what we understand about President Biden is that he is supportive of infrastructure development. And why that's important is the way that we are presenting this project in DC is that it is a piece of critical infrastructure for the state of Alaska. It is to provide us that opportunity to be able to access those resources, bring them to bear for the benefits of Alaskans, as well as make sure that we're able to meet our state compact of using our natural resources to be able to help in the operations of the state of Alaska. So President Biden, again, we've been talking to what was the transition team, and now those new members that are going into his administration and key departments. We're having those conversations about why this project would fit and meet the new president's administration's goals, specifically about cleaner burning fuels in interior Alaska, but also about the opportunity as a transition fuel on the world market to make sure that, again, we can help reduce the overall carbon footprint in our neighbors to the west in Asia, with burning, moving away from their coal-fired generation to natural gas. Next slide, please, Jimo. So I wanted to share with you, again, some of the inputs that are going into the Biden administration. And this one is from a progressive policy think tank that it's been working to temper the reality that natural gas must play a role in moving towards renewables. The second bullet set clearly identifies it. Renewables are not going to be able to be turned on with the flick of a switch. There's going to have to be a transition. Natural gas can do that. Natural gas can provide for those energy relief within Alaska, but it also can provide for a significant backstop to the future wind and solar, like we're seeing in Texas right now. With their wind turbines freezing up, they're not producing any energy, so they need to have natural gas to be able to help provide the energy to be able to hopefully keep those folks warm. But the rolling blackouts are giving them cause for concern as Texas is seeing very significantly cold temperatures. All right. Next up. So the infrastructure and stimulus support. Again, this concept of the initial phase of the Alaska LNG project is really predicated on attracting and receiving infrastructure funding to be able to develop the project, but also to invite and entice that outside private sector development to be able to move this project going forward. One of the issues that the governor had with the previous stimulus packages that came to Alaska was that they were very prescriptive, and the Department of Treasury was coming in with very defined ways on which money going to the states for COVID relief could be spent. And so the governor has asked us to work for greater flexibility for states to prioritize its own initiatives. As monies come available to the states, then the governors and localities would like to be able to use that money as they see fit to best address the needs of their citizens. We've been in conversations with our congressional delegation on the stimulus support. We all know the reality of the tremendous amount of money that's being talked about for the next phase of the CARES Act at $1.9 trillion, and then the goal of the infrastructure type package soon thereafter. That amount of that package, people are talking again in the trillions of dollars. So for Alaska, if we're able to raise our hand and identify, about a $4.5 billion ask for what we call a critical piece of infrastructure, that's our goal in talking to Congress. To assist in that, we've contracted with a couple of firms from both sides of the aisle. Brownstein, Hyatt, Faber, and Holland & Hart are two firms that are providing both strategic counsel and communication assistance to me. Their main representatives in Alaska for Brownstein is a guy by the name of Mark Begich, former Senator Begich, and then for Holland & Hart, their lead is former Governor Sean Parnell. So that team that was Governor Dunleavy's economic assistance team when COVID first hit is working again together to help us draft the message and present this to Congress and other organizations to be able to hopefully gain a foothold to move this project forward. So next slide, please, Jimmo. So going forward, federal funds are key, but also the funding from private sector. In our case, it would be a lead party who would then become what we call an owner, builder, operator. They'd be investing approximately $1.5 billion of their money in addition to the federal stimulus. And the goal initially is to provide gas to Fairbanks at a 15 per million BTU level. All right, a question from Lisa.
Actually, sir, we've got several questions stacked up. If you'll just go ahead and let's finish this slide, and then we'll get down to it in earnest if we may.
Okay, very good. And that's what we're all about. So you've heard me say $15 initial goal, $5 ultimate goal with the full build out of Alaska LNG. Alaska LNG initial phase would have great job creation, but the secondary phase would have even larger job creation across the state of Alaska. So our goal is to be able to initiate this work, provide an economic recovery option for Alaska, and cleaner burning fuel to interior Alaska. Thank you, Jomo.
Thank you, sir. All right. Well, thank you for the presentation and the walkthrough. I guess I'll just go ahead and get started, if I may. There's been a long-running discussion across the state of Alaska about how Alaskans benefit most from their energy resources. Effectively, we've been running a socioeconomic experiment now for, say, better than 60 years, where the state used all of its muscle and horsepower to keep energy costs low in a particular region and let the rest of us ride the market. $15 per MMBTU is actually a little bit more than what we're currently paying for LNG into the tank. How do we Alaskans, what is it really going to take to even make that price real, this $15 per MMBTU, but really to drive it down which is where we interior Alaskans would actually receive benefit.
Okay, so to develop this concept, again, we looked at the various options that would potentially have residents in DC. So we talked about either going for full stimulus funding at $5.9 billion, which would then mean that we would only then have to charge the cost of the gas and the infrastructure to Fairbanks. Or we could bring in the private sector to be able to help us to develop this project and meet the overall goal of the administration, as well as our board of directors, to be able to move to a private sector-led project. So we had to identify what was going to be a threshold amount that would be meet the demands or meet the needs of that private sector investor for their investment dollars. And so that's where we, based on what we anticipated to be an initial demand potentially in Fairbanks from power supply generation and power plant conversions from existing fuel sources to new fuel sources. We used a 25 million standard cubic feet a day demand as the base threshold. And then that in turn related to approximately $15 per million BTU amount to be able to meet the rate of return that private sector developer would expect to receive for his funding. Now, the next phase of it, how to bring it down lower, is ultimately the full execution of the Alaska LNG project. And that's phase 2 of the project. Because once we're able to execute and develop the gas treatment plant and pull in Prudhoe Bay gas, and then ultimately the liquefaction facility in Nikiski, and have those that gas to world market, that's when we can bring the gas down to that $5 per million BTU. And that's really the ultimate goal of this. So Jomo, if you could go to the backup slides, there's a slide that I wanted to show folks about where AGDC sits right now in regards to our competitors on the world market on delivery of gas. This slide here just gives an indication of spot prices over the last year, going from a range of about $2.50 per million BTU upwards of what were $30 to $35 per million BTU towards the end of December, early January. And now they've stabilized back down into around the $8. And that's, again, spot market prices. Next slide. This indicates, and this chart shows that that dark gray bar in the middle is what we feel the cost of supply would be for delivered LNG to Asia. So this is at the dock face. And those projects to the left are our competitors that have higher costs, and those projects to the right have lower costs. So when we began this journey to advance this project, the Alaska LNG project back in 2015 was at that nearly $12 cost of supply. And then the work that we've done in reducing the overall cost, looking at opportunities and shifting the way that we have set up the tolling arrangements through the project components has allowed us to be able to reduce that cost now down around $7.25. So that puts us in the middle of the pack. Now, ultimately, we know that there are opportunities to be able to reduce that even lower. When we look at the overall cost of the gas on Prudhoe Bay, looking at utilizing some of the benefits that are in place for natural, for financial incentives with the loan guarantees that are in place by the federal government, that we think we can move that $7.25 down into the $6 range, which puts us even more competitive on the world market. That's what's going to drive this project through to actual construction and that $5 per million BTU delivery cost of gas in Alaska.
Mr. Soley, I saw you had taken yourself off mute for a moment.
I am off mute, Mr. Chairman. I do have a question. Frank, thanks for the presentation and for continuing to work on an Alaska gas project. Many of us have history in that endeavor. Can you just give a little more understanding on the federal funding piece? I guess I'm trying to understand. You talk about stimulus funds, and is the $4 billion that you're looking to access, have those already been appropriated in the previous package, or is that under a potential new package? Can you talk a little bit about the process, the grant process? Is it who would Alaska be competing with? Just those kinds of things. I'm trying to get a sense for that. The funding and where it's at currently, and then how we would fare in a competitive process, if it is competitive, or if it's simply an appropriation process.
No, good question, Rick. Thank you. So we all know that Congress in 2020 appropriated funds through the CARES Act to be able to provide states and localities and businesses COVID relief monies. So that CARES Act, or CARES Act 2, is what's being discussed right now with the Biden administration and Congress, and that's the $1.9 billion, again, stimulus assistance that would come out to states, localities, and to businesses. So we are talking to Congress about the flexibility in that CARES Act funding, so that it was funds that could come to the state of Alaska for any means, not necessarily this project, but for any means, to be able to allow for local decision making and local allocation of those funding. That was part of the charge that we got from Governor Dunleavy when we're talking to Congress, is to talk about the need for greater flexibility rather than relying on Department of Treasury guidance and criteria for expenditures. Really what I'm talking about is, again, the next type of stimulus that has been talked about in DC, and that's for infrastructure stimulus. So when Congress and the administration wanted to look for ways to put Alaskans or Americans back to work, then they see that stimulus funding through infrastructure development is key and critical to be able to advance our economy overall and be able to meet the needs. What Congress normally does with infrastructure funds is follow very prescribed formula funding, whether it be the Federal Highway Administration, or Federal Aviation, or Federal Transit, or Ports and Harbors, or Clean Water, that goes strictly through existing programs and then doled out to the states and the federal entities. There are no programs for natural gas pipelines. There are no programs now for a lot of these renewable initiatives that the Congress and the administration would like to advance. So that's where we're talking about the area where there's flexibility and hopefully some opportunity where Congress can direct money through either block grants to the states or block grants to localities to be able to meet the needs that they want to advance and move forward for their infrastructure development. Projects that would follow. Go ahead.
Oh, I'm sorry. Please continue.
I was going to say, well, projects that would follow the normal course of routine through their formula programs, such as the State Transportation Improvement Program on highways, they would get funds right through them. Pipelines, renewables, those are going to have to require, a new kind of mindset in a way to be able to get an appropriation that would allow the states to be able to utilize them as they so choose.
So regarding the COVID relief funds, it almost sounds like, it really does sound like a super duper sized version of some of what Anchorage did with a little bit of its COVID funds regarding park and trail improvements. The fact that you had a lot of people out of work, and that using some of those funds for that purpose was helping them, pay their bills.
Right. So that's one thing that the Anchorage did do, again, and it was allowed under the regulations that the Treasury had put out. Were there other needs or other desires by the state of Alaska to use that funding? that's where the governor would like greater flexibility to be able to make those decisions for our state.
Ms. Mayo, I see that your hand's up, but Mr. Wilkin had taken himself off of mute first. May I please allow Mr. Wilkin to go first?
Sure.
Thank you, ma'am.
Good
Mr.
morning.
Wilkin?
Morning, Joe. Morning, Frank. Nice to see you again. So in a land far, far away in a prior life, I went through AGEA. And what I learned on this, and you were around at that time also, what I learned after all of the meetings and lobbyists and graphs and summaries and trade fairs and letters of all sorts from all sorts of people from across the world, what it really came down to at the end was the cost. And I'm looking at your gas strategies chart here. And I'm having trouble understanding how the governor or anyone can figure out how we pay for $5.9 billion pipeline to come to 100,000 people, Fairbanks. So I mean that goes right to cost, and you've kind of danced around this, and I understand it, but there also should be some sort of pro formas that are showing what it's really needed. If one thinks they can get 4 billion, it's probably needs to be a little more than a wish. But let me say that if we really want to buy into this 2035 goal that some folks think is achievable, and we're really talking about 5.9 billion to Fairbanks, I would suggest that we also in the same breath have the governor and others, including Fedco, think about how close we are to Watana. We're $100 million away from being able to build Watana. To talk about a gas line for $6 billion to Fairbanks and to ignore the benefit of hydro at Susitna-Watana, we really need to seize that that brass ring as it comes by, and we should be talking about both of those things because one is doable with $100 million check tomorrow. This project, and I use my experience at AGEA and my experience when we looked with MWH at the North Slope to bring gas to Fairbanks, the costs are just overwhelming. And natural gas, the world is awash in natural gas. And with the exception of Yamal, none of those fields have an 800-mile pipeline attached to it. So I get back to costs. And I appreciate what you're trying to do, Frank, as always. You're always so good at it. But at the same time, we need to be a bit realistic and not take our eye off of the ball. And in my world today, the ball is Susitna-Watana if we're talking free money and if we're talking infrastructure. Thank you again.
No, you raised good points, Gary, and it's good to see you as well. When we talked about near-term opportunities, that's where and again, I'm talking about with the governor, that's where we talked about what is out there that would have a significantly large enough impact and positive impact and able to put folks to work in the very near term. So Susitna-Watana, again, I worked on that in the 1980s, and I still feel it's a valuable project to be able to advance. I think that we're in a very challenged environment right now with the new administration in terms of permitting. I'm very, very thankful that we were able to conclude our efforts under the last administration and get those authorizations granted to us. Otherwise, this project may never have seen its conclusion of its environmental process. So I think that Watana has a place in the future. Again, the economics around this are when we talk about $4.5 billion of economic stimulus through infrastructure funding, it's not that there is we're not looking to meet a specific economic threshold. It's that it's providing energy for Alaskans, jobs for Alaskans, while we then ultimately get to the overall goal, which is the full build out of the project. And that's, again, the phased approach. Now, if we didn't do anything, then we could be looking for money to be able to advance projects that may not occur for another decade or more and have to go through the environmental gauntlet. What I was proposing was, again, just an initiation of a project where we, again, are advancing the project in total towards an economically viable project that would rely on private sector funding to be able to advance it. This effort is really kind of done in parallel while we're continuing to work towards bringing those private sector developers to the market. As we all know, the impacts on the oil and gas industry over the last year have been significant. Prices are now slowly rising up into the $60. So we hope that some of the bloodletting that they had occur over the last year, that they'll be looking towards opportunities in the future. When we look at the LNG needs and the growth opportunity in Asia, right now with those countries looking at carbon neutrality in 2050, 2060 timeframe, they're going to need more natural gas to be able to shut down their coal plants. And so the market forecasts that are coming from the likes of BP, Total, and those other consultants is that we'll be doubling the LNG demand over the next 10 years. So we'll go from 350 million metric tons per year to 700 plus million metric tons per year. Now, there are projects like Qatar that are advancing and moving forward, such as Yamal and Arctic 2. But Alaska LNG, with our project, we feel has an opportunity to compete in that market as well.
I just will say this. Well, I'll ask you first, Mr. Richards, President Richards. Do you have a little extra time to stay with us?
I've got a 9 o'clock another presentation.
Okay, then let's bang this out. Ms. Mayo.
Thank you, Jomo. Frank, it's good to see this presentation and get an update. Thank you. There are two other projects that are active, and one is Governor Walker's, and another is one that's being promoted by Meade Treadwell. I'm particularly interested in hearing about that one that Meade is talking about, where it's a short pipeline to an island off the North Slope and then using a tanker. What do you know about that, and how does this compare?
So thanks for the question, Kathy. Good to see you. What you're talking about is the concept that they call KELAC LNG. So KELAC is, again, utilizing North Slope natural gas resources. In this case, they envisioned starting at Point Thompson, and they would go with a concept similar to what Yamal has done with a gravity-based structure that would be built offshore to allow for LNG production as well, and delivery directly to tankers that would then apply the Arctic Ocean down to the Bering Sea and on to Asia. That concept is still being worked, and so I understand that they were looking at pre-feasibility concepts, looking at the design of the tankers necessary to work through the Arctic Ocean conditions on Alaska side to see whether or not it was actually feasible. That effort, again, would utilize Point Thompson gas. It would come in at a much smaller amount. I think they're targeting probably 4 million metric tons per year of LNG production. But they have to begin an environmental process similar. I mean, Watan has already advanced through a lot of its NEPA work, but they would just be at the beginning. And so they have that gauntlet to run.
Thank you.
I don't, just this is a personal note, I don't really look at an either or for Watana and say a gas project. Electricity would have to be, say, 5 cents a kilowatt hour to meet our community goals if it were to be used as a heating source. And I've seen nothing that says that we're going to drive down the cost of electricity that low. So the gas would still be necessary. We do have a couple of questions in the chat box, if I can try to burn through them. I am assuming that your utilization rate includes those large utility users like the military power plants, UAF, GBEA, and your demand assumptions?
Yes, absolutely.
I was concerned, I will tell you, sir, we've been concerned here for the longest time just on how our community could shoulder the cost of the lateral, both its construction cost and then its continuing O&M, let alone with a $6 billion front end. So again, just regarding that price, well, one of the questions we have in the chat box really regards rural Alaska. Again, if it's utility grade gas, that really does mean more pipelines to allow those further communities to utilize this gas. Would that be correct?
Right, so that was part of our legislative mandate that when we construct a project, we are to provide opportunities for gas offtakes to Alaskans. And so if there are communities, if there are resource development opportunities that want to access that gas, then we would create an offtake for those communities.
Okay. Well, again, clearly there's a nice sugar high that would come from the construction of this project. But again, the further benefit comes in low cost or lower and affordable cost energy. So really what we're talking about is really the private sector actors kind of holding in abeyance some of their profit till the further end of the line comes on and they can tap into the brass ring of the Asian market. And then what happens if that doesn't happen?
Well, again, the private sector entity is doing their own due diligence on the work that we have provided to them. They are looking at ultimately the overall goal of being the lead for the pipeline portion of the full Alaska LNG project. So they see this initial phase as the starting phase of that project. And that's their ultimate goal, as is ours, is the ultimate construction of the Alaska LNG project. So just, and I know I've got about a minute left, but for this concept, we're looking at federal infrastructure dollars that wouldn't require a payback. That would be a grant to the state of Alaska to be able to construct. The private sector money coming in at $1.5 billion would require, a rate of return for that private sector developer for that initial demand and future demand going forward. If demand grows in Fairbanks, all the better. The state can elect not to receive any rate of return on that $4.5 billion and help drive down the cost of that as more users come online. That's a decision that the state, along with our AGDC, would have to make at that time. But that would be, I'd love to be able to be in that opportunity to have more users, lower cost energy while we're advancing the full scale project to its hopeful conclusion. So Jomo, everybody online, I really appreciate the chance to be able to present this to you. Again, it's a concept to be able to help Alaskans in this unusual, extraordinary time. I look forward to, again, being able to present to you in the future. Thank you.
President Richards, thank you so much. We very much appreciate you taking the time with us. And yes, we may have to circle around to do a twofer on this one. But it's a very intriguing, clearly it's something that we've all been wishing and hoping for a very long time. It's intriguing that funds might be available to help us start pushing this project forward.
Okay, and one of the things I heard from members of Congress, Alaskans, as long as we can show some uniform support of a project as opposed to sniping at each other, is the only way we're actually going to be able to achieve any funding.
Certainly, it's always been very helpful to have that unified vision in helping to advance our projects. Again, sir, thank you so much.
All right, good day all.
Thank you, Jomo. I will follow up with you on a couple of things later today.
And I think what I will do, Ms. Parker, I'll go ahead and see if I can compile the questions from this list and forward them on to you.
That would be wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you.
And also a list of participants?
I will do my best. Yes, ma'am.
Okay. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye. All right. Well, thanks a million, everybody. All right. I think we are complete. It's just us chickens now. Are there any comments from anyone? Okay. By the way, in response to Mr. Soley, I am not Mr. Chairman. I'm just your dutiful facilitator. All right. Well, everybody, thank you so much. I am working on presentations for next week and coming weeks. I don't have anything nailed down, but of course, I will keep everyone informed. And yes, now that you mentioned it, this is directly to you, Director Wilkin. at IGU. It's the first I'd heard that we were only about $100 million away from being able to advance, say, a Susitna project. If you could let me know where you heard that, I'll certainly follow up. Would that be with AEA? I should be following up.
Yes, that's right. I was on ADA, and we chased for about 4 years. We chased and funded the Susitna-Watana permit process through FERC, and we were $100 million away from getting the final FERC license, which allows the state to go out and actually build it. That when times got tough 4 or 5 years ago, the governor, forget his name, Walker, took it out of the capital budget, and so we were left with the project $100 million short. So yeah, absolutely, that's what we need for the license to build. And with that, we can go out and all the data is there. And I think it would be perfectly appropriate to have a presentation on that because that is, I mean, that is a backbone of us being energy sufficient. And those folks that for some reason don't think that hydro is renewable, I can't get my head around that. But to answer your question, Jomo, yes, you'd go to ADA, and there's a whole book, and I can give you the people that you'd want to talk about that. And we ought to be riding that horse. It's quarters in the couch for 100 million in today's environment, and we should be pursuing it.
Okay, well, and actually, so I was already about to follow up with GVEA. They had a story in the paper. First of all, so this is for you, Director Newman. We'd already had, we were about a year out from our latest update from GVEA, and I saw something in the paper regarding their diversification of portfolio. So I was already about to follow up with them. Maybe we'll do a little bit of a renewable sustainable days for a couple of future presentations. Okay. Well, everyone, as always, thank you so very much. We will be keeping an eye on this project, and we will be inviting Mr. Richards back for follow-up as this progresses. But with that, I hope everyone has had a great Valentine's Day weekend. Hope you're having a good, beautifully snowy Tuesday, and everyone stay safe, happy, healthy, and we will see you next week.